In this episode of the UX Tea Break, I look at common mistakes that I see people make when they're moderating a usability test. So this particular question comes from Anne Gregory, and Anne writes, I'm about to moderate a usability test. Do you have a checklist I can use so I do a good job? So Anne, you are somebody after my own heart. I like to use checklists, both to make sure that I don't forget things, but also as a way of reviewing my performance. So for example, there is a checklist that I use. I'll provide a link to it below in the notes, and I'll quickly show it to you now. And it's something that I use when I'm working with teams and coaching them on running a usability test. So if we take a look at this particular test moderation checklist, you can see there are various sections here, including things like welcoming the participant, starting a new task, what to do during the task, asking questions and wrapping up, and so on. And feel free to download that, adapt it, and use it for whatever purposes that you have in mind. Now, I'm not going to talk about that though, because I think one thing that's more interesting is to look at a handful of overriding principles, common mistakes that I see when people are moderating usability tests. So you could think of this as a meta checklist for making sure you're doing the right kind of thing. And I think there are 5 common mistakes that I see when people are moderating usability tests. The first one that I commonly see is people answering questions that the participant poses. Now this is a difficult one because you want the participant to ask you questions in a usability test, such as how do I get back to the home page, or I don't understand what this button does, or things like that. You want them to ask questions, but the worst thing that you can do in a usability test is to answer those questions, because when the participant's asking a question, it could well be a significant problem that they can't overcome, or it could be a trivial problem that if they just looked around for another couple of seconds, they'd find the answer to it. And if you step in too early and answer their question, you'll never know whether that was a big problem or a minor problem. So what I recommend that you do when you're asked a question in a usability test is you use the boomerang technique and you reflect that question back to the participant. So if they say, how do I get back to the home page? You might say, how do you think you get back to the home page? If they say, where do I find the option to do X? You might say, well, where do you think you find the option to do X, and so on. You get the idea. Another technique that I've come across, which is similar to this, is apparently in the UK driving test. It was so long ago that I did my driving test that I don't know if this is true, but so I've been told. Apparently, if you ask the driving instructor a question when you're on your driving test, the instructor says to you, please do what you would do if I wasn't here. And that's a good technique that you can use in a usability test as well. So don't answer questions. Second common mistake that I see when people are moderating usability tests is explaining the design. So it's very tempting when the participant does something the wrong way to say, oh, no, that's not what the designers expected. What you're meant to do is first go here and then you go to this particular page. And now let me leave you now to continue with the task. Well, you don't want to explain the design to your participants. That's not what it's about. They should be using the design as if they're using it for real. So you won't be there to coach them on the design when they're using it. So you shouldn't be coaching them on the design when they're in your usability test. If you find the temptation to say to someone, to explain the design to them, instead say to them, tell me what it is that you're doing right now, because if you ask that particular question, it will help you uncover what it is that's causing the issue that you're needing to explain to them. Now, third common problem that I see when people are moderating a usability test is that when they're interviewing rather than running a test. So user interviews are different from usability tests. With a user interview, you'll have a back and forth between the participant. The participant may still speak more than you, even though it's a user interview, which is appropriate. You want to get the participant speaking. But at the same time, there's something different about a Q&A. In particular, the participant looks at you rather than the product when you're running a user interview. With a usability test, you want the participant focusing on the screen. So if they're not spending their time looking at the screen, doing tasks, you're not running a usability test. Now, sometimes that's not your fault. Sometimes participants feel the urge to turn it into an interview, because it's a user research technique they're familiar with. So they may turn to you and ask you certain questions as you're running the session. If that happens, then pull your chair further back from the participant and make it clear that you're there to observe the participant rather than have an interview with them. Fourth common mistake that I see when people are moderating usability tests is talking too much. So with a usability test, it's the participant that should be doing the talking, or at least the behaving, not you. You shouldn't be saying anything other than the obvious prompts, such as tell me what you're doing right now, or please remember to think aloud, and so on. So if you're speaking and asking lots of questions of the participant, you're not running a usability test. Now, it may well be that you've got a participant who isn't very talkative. Sometimes that happens. You get a participant that, even though you've trained them to think out loud and you've told them that's an important part of the study, they may not be particularly good at doing it, and they may just do the behaviours. Now, by all means, prompt them and remind them that you want them to think out loud, but if it continues, then feel free to just let them carry on in silence carrying out the usability test. Don't feel you need to fill that silence, because you've still got their behaviour afterwards. You can see what they did, and that's the critical part of running a usability test. Now, ideally, they will think aloud, but don't use that as your excuse to fill the silence. Your role is to keep quiet during a usability test. And the final problem that I see when people are moderating a usability test is soliciting opinions and preferences. I've talked about this in other of these UX tea break videos, but it's not your job to find out what people like or dislike about the interface, in the sense that you shouldn't be asking them questions like, do you like the font size that we're using on this screen? Or what do you think of the visual design? Or do you like the navigation on the left or on the right hand side of the screen? You shouldn't be asking those kind of questions, because if you ask that question, the participant will give you an answer, but it may not be very deeply held or well thought through. And you'll then direct them to issues of the interface that they might not have otherwise paid any attention to. Now, that's different from the participant volunteering an opinion about the interface. If they say, this font size is so small I can't read the text on the screen, then that's a data point and it's worth making a note of. But that's different from you soliciting that opinion in the first place. So that's my kind of meta checklist for running or for moderating a usability test. Feel free to download the more detailed one, and if you have any questions you'd like me to answer in these UX tea break videos, please post them below.